Good evening, good evening. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Canon Conversations, and tonight we are exploring global perspectives. I am the Reverend Dr. Melanie Jones Quarles. I teach theology and ethics on the Richmond campus at Union Presbyterian Seminary, as well as direct the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. For those of you who are just learning about the center, the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership, we recognize the significance of centering Black women's scholarship as viable sources and resources for theological education. Our mission is simple: to nurture the soul work of Black women as we cultivate pathways to whole communities. This Canon Conversations represents one of our newest webinar series that was launched by the Center in order to engage all things womanist wisdom as a way to support and encourage new titles, writers, and womanist ideas. Tonight, we have the pleasure to be joined by no stranger to us, of course, but the phenomenal, the incomparable Dr. Oluwatomisin Oredein, who is an assistant professor in Black religious traditions and constructive theology and ethics, and the director of Black church studies at Bright Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas. Her scholastic and creative work engages theopoetics from a Black diasporic perspective, constructive theology, liminal identity and faith, African and American articulations of womanist theology and ethics, and post-colonial thought. She is the author and the reason why we're here of the text, Theology of Mercy, Amba, Oduyoye, Ecumenism, Feminism, and Communal Practice, which is a Notre Dame Press monograph that links how the events and pursuits of Mercy Oduyoye's life inform her ecumenical path and the formation of African women's theology. Dr. Tomi is also the co-editor of the anthology through Erdman's Press, Theopoetics in Color, Embodied Approaches to Theological Discourse, the first theopoetic work featuring all racial and ethnic minoritized scholars. And she is the author of the book In Process, The Care Book, a theological ethic of care, which examines an ethic of care for a minoritized theoethical perspective. Welcome, Dr. Tomi. It is so good to have you back in the virtual landscape, to have you back with us on tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here, excited to have a fantastic conversation around a heavy hitter in the field.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, if you are joining us tonight, go ahead and let us know that you are with us tonight and where you're joining with us from. I want us to jump right in because I know we have a lot to discuss, and I want to make sure that we are able to fully give attention to this award-winning monograph and this important text. I see folks join us from Richmond and from the UK, so welcome.
Lovely.
Here's my first question. Dr. Tomi, what inspired you to write this book? And tell us a little bit about your journey.
Thank you for that question. What inspired me to write this book? The long and short of it was me. As a Nigerian American, born in Nigeria, raised in the United States, I wanted to know if there was a theological voice that sounded as close to me as possible. I went to divinity school, learned about Black theology, learned about womanist theology and ethics, and just ate because there was just so much nutrition and nourishment there. But I was like, but it's not quite me. read a little bit of African theology from male perspective and thought, okay, like I like some of what they're saying, but it's still not quite me. One of my committee members at the time, Dr. Esther Akalatse, she pointed me towards African women's literature, and then she said, you should read some African women theologians, the most popular being Mercy Amba Oduyoye. And I said, say less. So I read her. My first text was Daughters of Anua. And I saw the truth telling in there. I saw the honesty. I saw the critical thinking. And I thought, yes, somebody who's trying to talk about theology in a way that's attentive to the particularity of identities, specifically Black African and being a woman or a biological female, and what the culture has kind of instilled around that having a theological perspective that held both in a critical manner, not in a, we're just going to accept everything handed down to us, but in a critically thinking manner. It really, really interests me in Oduyoye. So I read everything that I can get my hands on. And I said, I want to write about her. I don't know why I didn't hear about her until I was in my doctoral program. But I said, I want to write about her, and I want to hopefully inspire others to pick up the mantle and write about her as well, because she's saying really important things that everybody who studies Christian theology and ethics need to hear.
Absolutely. I'm looking at the chat and I'm just saying, wow, we have folks joining. Welcome, Michelle from Wichita, Kansas. Welcome, Charity from the UK. Tamisha from Pasadena. Melba and Paula from Richmond. Beverly from Columbia, South Carolina. Helen from Dubuque, Iowa. So there is range on tonight. So welcome to everyone. You already said it. Mercy Amba Oduyoye is a giant for sure. Who, for those who've never heard of her witness or her work, can you just kind of walk us through a little bit about her biography? Who is Mercy Amba Oduyoye?
Mercy Amba Oduyoye is a woman who never lost sight of herself. She was born and raised in Ghana. She was born into a big family, to a father who was a pastor, a mother who stayed at home, but parents who were very clear about who they were and who they came from. She carried that, including her curiosity around learning. Her father encouraged her to be in the education field. Her mother encouraged her to remember that she was first and foremost an Akan, which is a subgroup of Ghana. She was an Akan woman. And Akan women have a certain kind of place and standard in their history, in their people. The Akan people, they are also matrilineal. So women are actually elevated and lifted up as important to as central in many ways to who the people are. So she learned, she grew up learning and knowing and holding at her core, women are important. If God's important, or the divine is important to her people, because she also was not afraid to kind of allow her culture to be in conversation with the Christianity that her grandparents had accepted and kind of passed down. If God was important, if her culture and identity were important, then she was very intent on creating theological language that was able to hold and make room for both. She was highly aware that as a woman, she lived in many interesting tensions and contradictions, and she allowed her theology to talk about those things, to express those things, and to wrestle with who God is and what was the work Jesus was doing, what was the work the Holy Spirit was doing. What does the church mean if you take the realities that people such as African women endure, if you take those and say, this is important to our understanding of Christian theological discourse. So she created the discourse that was going to center African women's realities and questions, African women's theology. Now, African women's theology was a theological perspective that uplifted the experiences and stories of continental Black African women, but was always in conversation with other minoritized groups all over the world. So other third world women theologians, African women's theologians were in conversation with them. They're all trying to figure out, how do we uplift women in our respective contexts? They're in conversation with womanists in the United States. Okay, what can we learn from each other around how to fight repressive and oppressive practices and situations? In conversation with Black theologians as well. Again, there's a Pan-Africanist movement that's happening. So, different groups all over the world are in conversation with each other. It's no different in the theological circles. So Mercy, she was everywhere. She was talking to everyone, and everywhere she went, she was uplifting the truth that African women are just an important piece in Christian theological conversation as anyone else. And if that's not the case, she said, let's talk about it. Let's talk about what it's meaning for your theology if we are not part of the conversation as well.
Yeah, that's so amazing. I shared with you prior to our conversation, I just came back from Ghana, traveling with a group of about 7 students and one of our professors here, Dr. James Th.D, who leads our Sigmund Rhee Global Mission Center. And we went to Ghana, all throughout Ghana, actually, from Accra to Kumasi to Cape Coast, Nina to Akropong. And one of the things that we not only celebrated about going to Ghana was the opportunity to go to the Talitha Kumi Center there at Trinity Theological Seminary, which I believe is the oldest theological seminary there in Ghana, and is a really ecumenical effort that combines not only Presbyterians, but also Methodists and even Pentecostal, which is one of the, as we know, largest global Christian reformations or movements across the world. And I was so inspired by the center because the Talitha Kumi Center, which comes from that gospel text, little girl, get up, right? But it mirrors in many ways the Cannon Center, right? In a kind of similar interest to nurture and to support and to advance theological study and exploration for women that have historically been systemically excluded from these theological conversations and or whose voices are not made primary, right, as primary sources for this theological reflection. So I say that to say, when I saw the title of your book, The Theology of Mercy, Amba, Oduyoye, it is so striking, but it is also just an amazing way to honor the witness of a giant, for sure. Auntie Mercy, I think, is 91 years old, celebrating such, and that is just the kindness of God to be able to live that long and to share space with us and to share with so many generations. But to put her theology as central, right, as leading for African women theologians and for all of us. What influenced the title of the book?
Yeah. Thank you for your question. One thing I wanted to like insert from the Talitha Kumi Center, that I thank you so much for connecting what you're doing with their mission as well. One thing I love about what they're doing, Oduyoye speaks to this, and I think you're doing it as well, is that there's this intergenerational initiative there. So it's not just let's just bring other women. It's women of different ages, making sure that there's continuity, making sure that the mission continues to be supported on every end, making sure that people who are younger also get to speak into the future of what they want their voice and their discourse and their presence to be. So one thing I love about Talitha Kumi, what I love about what you're doing as well, is that you're not just keeping it as one thing. You're allowing it to evolve. You're allowing it to change. You're allowing it to speak to what the reality is. And the reality is that time shifts, ideas shift, reality shift. And theology needs to keep up with what's happening in the time. So I just wanted to name that real quick. The title, it had to be The Theology of Mercy Amba Oduyoye. She's written countless books, she has countless chapters, countless articles, short and long. I've been amazed at how much she's written. It's almost as if every request to write something, she says yes, because she's one of the few who's, constantly trying to add to the discourse. So there needed to be a book that said, this is about her. Let me explain that. The Theology of Mercy Amba Oduyoye, the first 3 chapters are actually about her life and about her ecumenical effort. It's about everything that happened to her that shaped her, that kind of made her who she was. And then it spills into the next 4 chapters, which is kind of 4 major theological doctrines. But before we got to the theology part, we have to talk about the person. To know someone's theology, you have to know their life. So this was going to be about her theology, but it was going to be about her theology. The ecumenism, feminism, communal practice part, I actually wanted the feminism part to be first, because that was really important and central. She talks about her mother, her grandmother, the women before her, kind of showing her who an Akan woman is, and that determined her perspective, her worldview. The ecumenism, she knew she was one of few. So she went into all these different spaces internationally to make sure that African women had a voice there. And when they saw her, a lot of people said, oh, we want you to be in leadership. We want to ask you to do this. She said yes to those posts and positions because she wanted to make a change. Again, that's where she befriends a lot of people. That's where she knows white male theologians. She knows African male theologians. She knows African-American male. She knows African-American women. She knows Filipino theologians, Asian. She knows everybody, but she knows everybody because she says yes to going into these different spaces and making sure that African women are represented there. And the communal practice, her whole mission and vision is for African women to be treated with dignity and get the space that they deserve. When thinking about cultural ideas around religion, but also core theological ideas. Theology is primarily influenced by culture. One's theology is influenced by their culture. She wants to put that in the forefront and say, my culture values community. So if women are not considered valuable and are not valued, then my culture is not being honored. So yes, it had to be the Theology of Mercy Amba Oduyoye, because she's the one who, in many ways, did this missional work to make sure that the world heard about African women's theology everywhere she went.
Yeah, I love that. Tamisha Tyler, she dropped this quote from you: to know someone's theology, you have to know her or their life. And that is so essential. I think that is right in line with a kind of liberationist impulse: life first, theology second, right? That we come to know not only how we think about God as we come to know ourselves, right? And our own stories that inform our theologizing. So I really love that. And I also love this real sense that, and what you share in terms of not only what folks know perhaps of Mercy, Auntie Mercy, is her leadership by co-founding the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians, or even her work globally, as you talked about, in terms of, I think, the World Council of Churches and other organizations like that. But that she wanted to not only meet folks, but also ensure that there was an exchange, that there were pathways by which folks can come into their own knowing, right, and their own journey. Absolutely. I can only imagine interviewing, perhaps, Mercy Oduyoye. What was your most significant interview, or give us a window in, if you will, to your conversations with Auntie Mercy?
Absolutely. I was first able to do an interview with Journal of Feminist Studies and Religion. It was called Across Generations, and it's basically a young scholar, I was a PhD student at the time, gets to examine a giant, in the field. And we transcribe it, and they make it kind of its own article. From there, I realized I need more interviews. So, well, first, anywhere that she was, where she was speaking, I would try to attend those events. And since she, knew me, we would try to have conversations. So even though I've had, two or so more like formal sit down, hours long transcribing interviews, honestly, the most informative interview for me was at the Daughters meeting in, what was it, between 2016 and 2018, something like that.
Yeah, 2016, 18, yeah. They all run together.
And she was like, I want Subway. So I said, okay, I'll take you to Subway. Let's go get some Subway. So we went there, and I thought we were going to grab something and come back. She was like, okay, let's sit. I was like, okay, we sat down. And she just shared, and she just talked. And little things that, I'm not going to write down, I'm not going to transcribe, but just little things that showed me how human she was, showed me how, what is the word? Tireless her efforts have been. Showing me how thoughtful she is. Everything that she's done, every initiative she's created, co-founding the Circle, thinking around the details of that. She's very careful. She's very deliberate. She's very thoughtful. And it's all towards inclusivity. She just wants to make sure that everyone is seen, everyone is heard, and everyone is respected. So just kind of sitting with her, eating Subway in a Subway in Georgia. That wasn't an informal interview, but it was actually where the fangirl blinders kind of came off, and I saw, like she's just a person who wants the right things, and she's dedicated her life to pursuing the right things, and hopefully teaching the next generation to also pursue the right things.
Let's talk about this beautiful cover art. For those who haven't purchased the book, you absolutely, I think we'll drop some links in the chat, but you absolutely need to get yourself a copy. But the cover art is literally breathtaking. Oh, yes. It is breathtaking because it values her silhouette, her image, her face right there on the cover. I'm just curious. I always ask this question. How did you choose this cover? Who's the artist or designer? Anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, no, absolutely. A couple years ago, it was either 2020 or 2021, through a fellowship with Sacred Rights, I got to write a piece on Oduyoye for Sojourners. And somebody who was a fan of Oduyoye decided he wanted to do this wood piece. And so he kind of created this piece and gave it to Sojourners for free because he's been a fan, so excited that there's more coming out about her. So he just gave it to Sojourners. When the book was in process and production, They said, we love this cover from the Sojourners thing that you did. We're just going to ask, the same artist, his name is David Barthold. Can we use it as well? He said, absolutely. So I appreciate his excitement and his generosity, because he was just inspired and decided to kind of create something that centered her. And it was really important for me that you don't get these abstract images of something that has nothing to do with her, or like a mask that doesn't really mean anything. No, it is her. She's looking at you, and this is her theology. She is here to tell you about her life and the theological life that came about as well.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful. I'm thinking about this, and we keep saying the word theology, and wondering how you understand this book to contribute to theology as a large umbrella, to African theology, perhaps, as a way of thinking about this as well. But
yeah, so Oduyoye created the entire discourse of African women's theology. What that is going to do is say that, all right, how do African women do theology? How do African women experience the stories and the narratives and the lessons of Scripture? How do they think in concert with their religious traditions that have been passed down, their syncretic traditions? What do they sound like? Oduyoye's effort was to basically create God talk in the accent of African women. So she's not afraid to say, yes, we speak with an accent. Our theology speaks with an accent. And in that, we're going to make you hear something a little differently, hear a doctrine a little differently, hear a core theological idea a little differently. One thing that I loved writing and just kind of digging in a bit more, that I think she pushes, is around Christology. She does this interesting take around centering on Mary and Elizabeth, and how that moment where John leaps in Elizabeth's womb is not necessarily a story about the boys. It's not John and Jesus. That's not the center per se. But what if Christology is happening in this women talking? So in the midst of women sharing and exchanging with each other, what if that's the place where we can start thinking that Christology is born? So she's not doing anything radical, but she's saying, let's make sure we notice the women. Let's make sure we notice the minoritized women. What's particular about their cultures? What are they bringing from who they are that might give us more information about something? I know that one thing that we tend to do is a lot of times with Christian scripture, Hebrew Bible, New Testament, even the other books that may or may not make its way into our theology, we tend to forget who people are just so we can kind of move to the larger parallel, the larger lesson. Oduyoye is asking, what if we kind of stop and see who people are? What if we recognize that this is a North African woman? Or what if we recognize that this is an East African woman in this story? Or she wants to zoom in, and she wants us to pay attention to the particularity and the details of people's lives. And if that means that we can't say that we automatically know something, that's okay. What we can do is say, well, based on what we know, who we are, this is what we can see. This is what we do know. These are the questions that come forth. Questions aren't bad. Questions are sometimes us being honest.
Michelle Armster asks the question, or says, I continue to be inspired by her communal hermeneutic approach. Yeah. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Oduyoye is not saying anything new. This is something that I point to throughout the book. Oduyoye is saying, African culture, African communities emphasize a holistic, balanced, communal approach. What's happening with patriarchy kind of determining our theological outlook, with a lot of things, with gender hierarchy, with sexual hierarchy, also just kind of with colonialism, with white supremacy kind of coloring our theological lens, is that we start getting further and further away from that which we say we are, which is for each other. So the only thing Oduyoye is trying to do is just tell us, hey, remember who we are. Let's remember who we are theologically. And if we get too far away from that, then an honest theological lens will kind of bring us back to ourselves. But some of us have gotten very far away from the essence of who we are, who we believe we were created to be, who we say we are. So let's come back to ourselves.
Yeah, I love this kind of opening part of the book when you talk about Oduyoye's theology and kind of map out for us its relationship to African women's theology, or how Oduyoye has formed African women's theology. And you say, this is the theology we all need. Why do we all need this theological perspective?
It's, well, one, we are always better when we hear from as many of us as possible. One thing I always challenge and encourage my students to do when we're trying to get some tighter language, clearer language, honest language around our theological perspectives, is that we're all the church. We're all the body of Christ. Those who profess to be a follower of Jesus Christ are all part of the body. So remember your body, you know? I'm already forgetting the question, but there's just there's, I don't know, she puts forth this push to just remember that we are a we. Just to clarify, the question again was,
why do we all need this theology?
Yeah, because similar to the answer of the last question, because we need to remember ourselves. And again, if you are able to see something, hear something, a story, an idea, in a hermeneutical light that can kind of shine a different type of light on the message, then it'll click with you. It'll stay with you. It'll hopefully shift something in you that allows for a change in ideology, a change in your action, a change in sight and perspective and how you see another. And that's what theology is supposed to do. Theology is supposed to kind of offer this reconciliatory term. We're trying to get to God. In some ways, Oduyoye is saying there's also God in African women too.
Yeah, I love that in relation to this kind of sacred African cosmology that reminds us that we are we, as you say, right? Yeah. And that is this interdependence that we all share, as well as alongside and with the divine as well. Mm-hmm. A theological biography. Yeah. We know some of us know about spiritual autobiographies or spiritual biographies, but what I see you doing is somewhat of a theobiography. What's the biggest misconception that folks have about writing about someone else's theological journey?
Thank you for that question. I would say the biggest misconception is that you can know everything about that person and that you can tell it in a way that's accurate, unless they are telling it themselves. At best, you're trying to interpret what you think they mean. based on all the information and evidence you're able to gather, based on trying to read between the lines and read about the nuances, based on recalling what was said in that interview and what that tone meant and kind of interpreting everything. You're not going to know everything about everyone. What you can do is say that this is my perspective. This is, again, the light that I'm going to shine on this person's life. And I did not write this book so that people can say, okay, Dr. Oredein is the expert. I don't like the language of expert. I think it is false. But I want you to say Dr. Oredein is a conversation partner around us needing to talk about Oduyoye more and more. I want this book to not be the last book about Oduyoye. I want this book to be the first of many because she needs to be thought with and explored, not in a weird mastery sense, but in a way of she is rocking my world and I need to keep thinking with her. I think of books as conversation partners, and I want her to be a conversation partner for many.
I think you don't really know what you think about a thing until you start writing it. Until you write a book, do you begin to understand, what do I actually think about this thing? So I wonder, what was your most significant discovery, or what surprised you while writing this work?
Yeah. So I said I'm Nigerian American, raised in a Nigerian household. So even though I have an American accent, the cultural staples are still embedded within me. I respect my elders. I don't question. I don't push back. I don't ask anything. I just say, like, okay, let me just hear your wisdom. I approached that with this project, and I realized I have a question about that. What do I do with these two potentially contradictory points? How do I tell this in a way that's honest about what I'm reading and what I'm sensing? What I learned was that I can question and I can offer a different approach to looking at something that she says so that we can have a bit of nuance. One thing that my eyes were open to was that kind of connecting to earlier in the conversation, there's a generational difference. I know how I'm thinking about race and gender, and I mean, even Western culture put on African culture from a certain time period. I had to be highly aware of all those things that were on my lens that was making me see what she was saying only in one way. That allowed me to offer a bit more nuance. And again, if I had a question, I would just be careful to kind of offer language around this might be happening, this might not be happening. I allowed myself to be in some ways put under the microscope when I was trying to tell her story. Because all I have to go off of is her writing, her words, but I don't know her feeling, I don't know her sentiment, I don't know all the details of what went into going through a particular moment. So if I'm writing about that moment, I say, this is the lens from which I'm coming to examine this moment. And I hope it opens up more conversation around what lenses we carry as readers and as people who are engaging people of different cultures, people of different races, people of different time periods, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How I know one thing might not be how she knew it. That needs to be named and attended to.
So much of what you shared just really parallels, I think, my own journey in terms of navigating and thinking really deeply about the work of Dr. Cannon, noticing the generational differences, noticing that I'm a student of her work and we have different kind of trajectories, but certainly informed, and also recognizing the ways in which I think these are building blocks. I think Dr. Cannon spoke of this in terms of a house, that someone lays the foundation and then others will come and put the frame together, and then more will come and add furniture. So this is a part of a larger, longer, constructive, right, story.
Yes, yes.
We're at the point where I want to invite folks who are joining us and who are watching, and sharing with us in conversation through your chats. Feel free to drop questions right here in the chat so that we can ask Dr. Tomi and to receive her perspective. So this is making space for us to have that dialogue with folks who are joining us and to keep that conversation going. One of the things I know is not only was this work important, but it's effective, because you earned the inaugural first time author award with the publication of this publication, this monograph, for Notre Dame Press. Let's talk about the reception of this book. How has it been received thus far?
Yeah, I don't know, but I mean, how do you know? The people who have purchased it and talked to me, thank me for the work. Numbers, all that stuff. Notre Dame, might know. But for me, the biggest thing is when people say thank you for writing something that is digestible, that's not difficult to read. That's the biggest compliment to me, because I don't always love reading. So when I'm reading, I want to read something that is clear, and I'm in theopoetics. I want to read something that's beautiful. I want to read something that's beautifully written. So if that comes across to anybody who's picked up the book, then I have done my job. But yeah, I want people to be able to say, I read this book and I can tell you about X, Y, and Z. I don't want them to have to decipher and decode. And no, I want them to be able to learn something, fairly quickly, and to be able to each one teach one, But numbers wise, I hope it's going well. But I just want this to be in classrooms, as many classrooms as possible, so that her name gets the room and the space that it deserves.
Well, I can say for sure you've done your work. It's beautifully written, and I can say that about all of your work. I think you just being a poet just adds something to us academics who have long, drawn out sentences that that mean a little of nothing. No, I'm joking, but the poetic kind of wit that you bring to the work is just really refreshing. Michelle Armster is asking another question, which I think is really important and actually something that opens up our conversation in relation to kind of diaspora and continental questions between or conversations between womanists and African women theologians. Michelle says, I would love to see a conversation between womanists and African women theologians. What topics would we discuss? Where would we gather? What do we need to know about each other?
In part, Dr. Quarles, I feel like your center has done a fantastic job answering the question, where would we meet? What would we talk about? I mean, African diasporic women's experience across the world, African American women's wisdom that can be shared. I mean, the center has been doing, fantastic work, especially the inaugural meeting was just a place where, Oduyoye was there. Everybody came together and showed that they've been in conversation, that they want to continue to be in conversation. But what would they talk about? Oh man, a number of things. One conversation that I've tried to open up a little bit is around nomenclature. I think it's very important to ask somebody what they want to be called. It can be quite easy once we kind of get a popular way to kind of group someone to just kind of say, oh, you're this. Some African women theologians consider themselves womanist. Some say, no, we're just going to do African feminist theology. Some say we're going to do African women's theology. But they're all, and they have always been in conversation. So just, yeah, I think conversations where everyone can learn from each other's wisdom, where everybody can learn the lessons that each others have experienced and see where they can apply it to their respective context. Everybody's trying to move towards complete liberation. So conversations around what's going on in the particularity of your community and your group. What can you offer me? What can you show me? What can you teach me? How can you help me think about something differently? Those conversations have been happening, and I hope they continue to happen, especially around what wisdom are we each bringing. But again, one thing that will be important is, okay, what do I call you? I think that can be a really critical first step.
Yeah, I think in addition to that, and I echo that, and I think we both talked about meeting Auntie Mercy at a consultation that the Daughters of the African Atlantic Fund put together for a series of years, which was right alongside this aim. I know that work had some challenge only because of COVID, but these consultations are certainly necessary to put spaces and places where diaspora and African women, continental African women, and so forth can begin to have conversations, because the work of colonialism, neoliberalism, all of these isms is intentionally designed to stifle and to keep us from being able to share theological, survival resources, pathways toward liberation. If those communications are cut off, then we won't have vision about how to move forward or how to seek liberation. And so hopefully consultations like that can continue. I also know, and we mentioned this before, the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians has its upcoming consultation, I believe, in Ghana this upcoming July. But one of the things that they've added as a component to that conference is virtual access. So the way that I think technology is opening up opportunities to kind of push against these silos and also create space in many ways that do not make it possible for us to always travel. We have to make these connections as much as we can online. Dr. Wallace in the chat says, yes, that consultation, if you look up the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians, that consultation you can register is the first week in July. So these are beginning spaces and places, but certainly we need to continue to multiply those opportunities, because we need to learn from each other.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Other questions that folks have on in the chat, feel free to jump in and ask those questions. I'll go ahead and ask you, Dr. Tomi, to help us think about, what is your enduring hope for this book? I mean, you've written it, obviously. It is available, and it is getting significant traction. But what do you hope for the book?
Yeah, I hope a few things. I hope it is the first out of, now to be clear, there are books written by Oduyoye where she kind of gives parts of her life story. There are anthologies dedicated to her that were written. I wanted to kind of offer the first book that kind of puts a lot of those things together and says this is one place where we can kind of find some details about her life, how things formed, and then how they kind of informed her theological outlook as well. But my enduring hope is that it's the first of many books that center her, that open up what her work and her theological perspective and her life means to Christian theology. For those who, because Christian theology and ethics can be fields where we get really hyper-focused about becoming the expert about something, about mastering something, and in this case, someone. And kind of as I was mentioning earlier, I hope that everybody who reads this book says, oh, I would have assumed this, or I would have assumed that. And they can see that the mirror is kind of turned back to them, or the magnifying glass that they're trying to kind of parse and pick out things to offer to show mastery and expertise. No, I want there to be things that are surprising. I want the tensions to be felt in the book, and I want people to ask questions. Okay, why am I receiving things this way? Why did I assume that? Why am I reading things this way? Why did I want it to be X, Y, and Z? Why do I want something to be X, Y, and Z? And in that, get clarity around what their theological genealogies are, what their theological hopes and desires are, and sit with, can this coexist with realities like Oduyoye's and other African women from different generations, from different cultures? One thing that I tried to put language around was some of the things that she's offering around what my generation has taught to be, feminist, especially my generation in the West, has been taught to think as feminist. She would say, that might not be as important. This is actually more important. And I have to sit with that and say, okay, why are these things that are framed in a particular way? What are they rubbing up against in me? So the enduring hope for this book is I hope that we are not only going to ask, more curious questions about Oduyoye's life and theology, but we can ask questions about our own respective lives and theologies as well. And again, see where they can coexist with her realities.
Dr. Beverly Wallace asks, how might we engage this work with African and African diasporic women who are not theologians? How might this affect healing of our global sisterhood?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, Dr. Wallace. One thing Oduyoye is really fantastic with is that even though she identifies as Christian, she does Christian theology, she does a little bit of ethics, she's fully aware that not all African women are Christian. One thing the circle is very intentional about, again, she's very intentional in her approaches with things, is it invites women who have been influenced in some way, touched by religion and culture. She has this whole approach called CURE, where she talks about culture and religious, I forgot the E part. But C is for culture and R is for religious, and then the E might be like experience or something of that sort. But she is very forthright in naming that a lot of cultures have religious undertones, religious notes to them. And whether one is religious or not, women in that culture, in that society, in that group are impacted by it. So she takes this takes this approach of naming particularities within Christian theology for sure, but also naming how religion kind of impacts and touches and in some places overshadows many parts of the realities that affect African women, whether they identify as religious or not. So in terms of how might this affect healing of global sisterhood, I think keeping in mind that everybody does not subscribe to the religious ideas that we are coming with is going to be deeply important. It doesn't mean that they are not impacted. I mean, colonialism in many ways is a Christian endeavor. So it doesn't mean that they are not impacted, but it might not mean that we are moving towards the same path. But what I can do is say that, all right, I can name our common location as people who have been impacted by the colonial legacy and the continuing legacies of Christianity. Naming the complexity, naming the nuances of that reality, I think is going to be deeply important. If we overlook it and try to move too quickly into, okay, this needs to happen without understanding, again, the details of who each other are, that can be a recipe for misrecognition and misunderstanding who's in front of us and who's beside us.
My hunch is that this next question from Dr. Paula Parker is related to not only this work, but your forthcoming work. And that is, out of your process, how have you discovered a way to develop a template for others to discover their theology?
I don't even know. I don't know if I've created a template of any sort. I think I have just taken seriously the reality and allowed that to be my methodology. And that is one's theology is influenced by their culture. So once you take that seriously, what questions does that open up? Well, first you got to tell me about the culture. You have to take that seriously. The culture is in some ways a theological arm in many ways. Yeah, and once you hold that truth, then other questions will open up, including why do they think this way as opposed to that way. But yeah, I think, you know, there are biographies about everybody, especially, you know, the big names, the white males, North African, Mediterranean voices. And they might tell a story or two about their childhood, but otherwise we don't know how they came to be how they are, how they came to see the world, how they did. So if, I guess my template would be, you got to take it seriously. How did they see the world? And then how did that flow into their theological outlook? Theology in many ways is outlook around the divine, oneself, and another. So how did their life influence their theological outlook? Thank you, Dr. Parker, for the question.
Madonfu, this is our last question. Owusu asked, and this may be a return to your own narrative. What would you say to younger Black women who are daughters of African immigrants in the West and finding their theological and even perhaps Christian or womanist voice?
Thank you, Medomfu Uwosu. What would I say? I will tell you the truth. It doesn't exist yet. When you were introducing me, Dr. Quarles, I think in my bio, I had American African. And that language trips a lot of people up because they're like, wait, what is that? This must be a typo. American African is intentional language that I'm using around my theological voice. Because as a West African raised in America, but again, still getting the value systems of my people, Yoruba people, I have theologically had to wrestle with what I believe, where I'm landing, what I agree with, what I'm learning from X, Y, and Z, and bring it together to say, okay, this is my ultimate conclusion. So I'm being nourished by African-American womanists. I'm being nourished by African women theologians. I'm being nourished by Black feminist theologians, whether they identify as West African, African-American, Caribbean. I'm hearing from all these different voices and saying, okay, and then this is the position, this is the posture from which I come. These are the questions that my posture are asking these different voices. What do I think? That to me is going to be my American African theological voice. So my answer to you, Medolfo, is you have to start creating it. You have to start writing it. You have to start calling it what it is. If you feel like, okay, I want to call myself African women's theologian, do that. If you want to call yourself a womanist, please do that. If you want to create a different name, if you want to call yourself a Black diasporic theologian, whatever language feels like it's not going to suffocate you, but it's going to honor the fullness of who you are. Because again, if you feel torn in many directions, sometimes you're going to ask, do I know who I am? You have to create your own voice. It doesn't exist yet. You have to create your own lane. You have to be in conversation with other immigrants who know your life and your experience and who have similar questions. You got to be in conversation with them. You got to write about it. You got to bring it up in your ecclesial context, churches, amongst your friend groups. You have to be the generative source of what that conversation can sound like, because that's what I'm trying to do.
I think that's a perfect way to end our conversation tonight, creating your own voice. And thank you, Dr. Tomi, for sharing this work, sharing the work of Auntie Mercy with all of us, and from your perspective and lens. And also, we are certainly going to be watching your journey. One of the questions that I wanted to end with your next writing projects, and I think they're Theopoetics in Color, which is an edited volume, as well as you're writing about an ethic of care. Is that right?
That's correct. That's correct.
Awesome. So we look forward to all of those works. Thank you again for joining us tonight, and thank you again for your work. For all of our friends from all over, literally, from both in the US and abroad, thank y'all so much for joining tonight's conversation. We're dropping in the chat a short survey just so you can help us help you, so that we can get feedback about how to make these conversations much better and most effective for your needs and for your interests. And as always, if you are looking to know anything about the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership, feel free to check out our website at centerforwomanistleadership.org, or you can kindly send us an email at cwl@upsim.edu. Again, buy the book, The Theology of Mercy, Oduyoye. Keep following Dr. Tomi, because I am certain that this is only the beginning of what will be a remarkable, remarkable journey for all of us. Thank y'all tonight. Thank y'all for joining us, and have a wonderful evening. See y'all soon.